he says, no, it's not handling right in turn one. It's not right in turn one. I'm like, okay, well, what's it doing? He goes, it's not what I want. That's not what I want. I said, well, how do I know what you want? And he goes, well, just look at the data. I said, what? And he goes, yeah, I'm telling you what I want in the data. You get me to do that one turn and you're giving me what I want. But all that other stuff in the middle is what I don't want. Oh, he is telling me what he wants. All I got to do is look at the steering trace. I want 11 positions. We're going to have 11 being the stiffest. Some engineer went, why? And he goes, because you can. Turns out Larry's favorite movie
is Spinal Tap.
Is Spinal Tap.
Okay, welcome to It's Not the Car. We're a podcast. We're a podcast about motorsport things as they relate to being human, which it may sound silly and redundant, but if you think it sounds silly and redundant, well, I mean, you've probably never read an SAE paper. And I mean, God, if anybody from the SAE hears this, I love you and engineering is very serious and that was a joke. Don't find me. I know you people have helicopters. So, I'm Sam Smith. I live in Tennessee. I am a writer and a journalist and a club racer. It's like Mike Myers said in Wayne's World, I have an extensive collection of name tags and hairnets. I also have Jeff. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Jeff Brown. I'm a shock guy.
Shocking.
Does that fit?
Oh, dad joke puns. We need more dad joke puns. Unfortunately, we're low on dad joke puns today because it's just Jeff and me. Ross is actually off on one of his rare vacations. He said something a while back that he takes a vacation every 30 years or something. This is one of them. He's on a 5-day hike through the Sierra in Yosemite, which I mention only because it sounds like a thing you would do if you were a very interesting person. And I guess that's accurate because Ross is a very interesting person, but also I'm envious as hell because it sounds great. Jeff, you ever hiked in Yosemite?
No. I told Ross before he left, I said, if you see Alex Honnold, see if you can beat him up, the face of El Capitan. Alex has got the record. Ross might, I know how competitive Ross is. I mean, he'd line up right next to him and give it a go. I know.
That sounds like Ross. Yeah. I don't know if I can picture him hanging off a sheer cliff face, but it sounds like Ross.
Yeah.
So, okay. So today's show format is a new one. It's something I came up with last week because it sounded fun, which, I mean, really, when you get down to it, that's the creative process for this show in a nutshell. We're not exactly rocket surgeons here, but we call this show format My Life With. And it's about the seminal moments in your learning curve with a subject, how you come to understand a valuable part of the racing or the driving equation over time, over your career, over your life, right? And how your understanding of that object or that concept changes over time. And if that sounds boring, well, the hope is it won't be, because we'll tell that story through anecdotes and the little aha moments that taught you things. And the cool thing about this is that Ross and Jeff they have these long, cool, complex careers that have been built on waking up in the morning and assuming that you don't know anything and learning something along the way. And the only way that you get good at what they do is by assuming you don't know those things, right? And as a result, the topic of My Life With, this format, it could be almost anything, so long as there are those little stories and those aha moments. Could be a technique, could be a particular track, a car, a part of physics, way of thinking or solving problems, whatever. And with Jeff today, we have, Jeff, do you want to say it?
Shocks. Or dampers. Yeah.
If you're an evolved human, although right. I've met some very evolved people who call them shocks, but
right.
Cue the sound anyway, because you said shocks, cue the sound of 1,000 people hitting the stop button on their pod show players and getting up to go do something more fun. Like, I don't know, what's less fun than, for most people than listening to talk about shocks, probably clipping their toenails or like smelling your kitchen trash or something.
We could rename the show though. It's not about the shock.
If you do that, I will get up, walk out the door, walk to California, find Ross in Yosemite, and tell him that we can't do dad jokes without him, and
okay.
I'll drag him back.
Because fair enough.
But here's the thing: shocks are interesting, man. Like there's I'm in that camp where when I was younger, I thought they were really kind of weird little tubes and boxes of magic, and it wasn't worth understanding. And the older I got, the more I learned about them, the more they became these really cool little boxes of magic and understanding. And Jeff's going to humor me here because we're going to kick this off. I'm not an engineer. I haven't even played one on TV, and I wouldn't dare play one here. But I figured I'd give an intro, just kind of describe the basics of how the machine works before we get to it. Jeff, do you mind? Will it make you cringe?
Go. No.
So
this will be good.
You got to promise to stop me if I get any of this wrong. I know how it works, but I also get lightly nervous because I'm sitting here talking to a man whose actual specialty is the gibberty-gook I'm about to say. So
go for it.
All right.
Give it your shot.
So, like you said, right, it's a shock, which is the shorter version of the phrase shock absorber, which is a distinctly American thing, a term that is both real and not real, because really the correct term is damper, and that's hinged on the job the machine does. So start with what a damper does. What does it do? It controls or damps the motion of a car's suspension spring, in this case, right? And that spring may not be a traditional coil-shaped spring. Remember, it is simply whatever springing medium is keeping the car off the ground and allowing the suspension to compress and release with load. Spring could be torsion bar or rod or torsional element of any shape. It could be an airbag. Could be, as in the case with some terribly old racing cars and in carts, could be just a function of the torsional rigidity of some part of the vehicle that doesn't look like a spring, right? It could be part of the frame or a suspension arm that's just bending, that's acting as a spring, right? And the damper exists for a bunch of reasons. Primarily, it exists because of the notion that springs are elastic things. When you compress one, it wants to return to its uncompressed state. And that wanting to return is, for lack of a better, it's literally just stored energy. The spring is released, that potential energy is released, and the way springs work, they don't just release it all at once. When you release them, they oscillate. They sit there and basically just kind of vibrate in some diminishing mirror of what their compressing motion looks like. And they do that until a number of things tied to the laws of physics basically say stop, and the whole thing kind of winds itself down and wears itself out. But that takes time. And in the sense of a vehicle's suspension, which is constantly being loaded one way or the other as you stop, turn, brake, accelerate, hit potholes or curbs or mother-in-laws or whatever, that process just takes too long. So a damper's job is simply to control the spring's motion. This usually, but not always, means slowing that motion. It's doing it with a typical coil spring, it's doing it in release and compression, right? Up and down, in and out. And dampers are like springs in that they take a bunch of forms, right? On one end, you have things like frame members, or like in a cart, you have the frame tubes that kind of sort of act as have a damping function to them. And on the other end, you have like the very primitive place that cars started off about a century ago. That was derived from how the dampers on, if you could call them that, on horse carriages worked, right? Where they were literally just a big friction pile that, it didn't so much dampen the shock as just kind of resist its motion, or dampen the spring as resist its motion. And you carry that all the way forward to where we are now, which is something like the modern hydraulic damper in all its forms, which uses valves and some essentially non-compressible fluid, sometimes a gas charge, sometimes it electronically varies the viscosity of that fluid, like in a magnetorheological shock, blah, blah, blah. Just gets more complex from there. Jeff, did I miss anything? Screw that up?
That was really good.
Hey, he can be taught.
That was no. That's really good. I'll add one thing, because a lot of people think shocks and dampers and springs do the same thing. You described it very well. The big key takeaway, I would say, is a spring is the force that a spring produces is based on its distance, how much it's been compressed. Mm-hmm. So it's a distance sensitive device. You compress a 1,000-pound spring, 1,000-pound per inch spring 1 inch, it's 1,000 pounds. You compress it another inch, it's at 2,000 pounds. A damper is a velocity sensitive device. It only adds any force when it's moving. So they work kind of in tandem, but they don't do the same job.
Ooh. And the whole cool thing about that force under motion and velocity is that they can be built and have been built, and that's how the machine has evolved, right? To offer differing resisting forces at differing speeds, not just differing speeds, but different accelerations of the shock itself, right?
Right.
So
Right.
these are super complex machines that when you, I mean, even some of the most complicated ones, when you pull them apart, they look really simple. And that's, I don't know, that's the kind of engineering stuff that I just like. It's like catnip. I geek on that stuff. But I wanted to do this format with shocks with Jeff, in part because I have an old book in my office that I bought immediately after I met Jeff, because I'm that kind of dork, that Jeff co-wrote with his friend Paul Haney. It's called Inside Racing Technology, and it was published in the 90s. It's this interesting and human and cool little kind of take on, serving as a primer on all the tech aspects of motorsport. And it was, again, it's from the 1990s, so it's outdated in a bunch of ways, but the fundamentals still apply. And Jeff, the section on shocks has a whole lot of Jeff in it, which made me very happy. And you, even when I mentioned some of this over the phone on text, we're going back on text message between you and me and Ross, and you sent a video of your son Colin, the IMSA driver Colin, who is now in his 30s, at age 5, making a video for kindergarten show and tell with the shock dyno in your house, which is just and it's like little baby Colin doing shock things, and they press the button and it actuates it, and it made me very happy. And that's the end of that story. But
it's yeah, shocks were a big part of my life and my race engineering life. And when you have a guy who can run the shock dyno for you and get the graphs and print them out and bring them into your office, then you can do more shocks while the guy is out there. He just happened to be 5 years old, but he was a really good shock dyno operator. That's
the great thing about parenting, is nobody tells you it's really just like it's a great way to get slave labor,
right,
and make your life easier. You know,
right. Well, I have to say though, in my defense, I got paid a certain amount per set of shocks that I was doing for customers, and Colin participated, and Travis, my other son, participated also, and they were as 7-year-olds, they were making insane amounts of money for a 7-year-old. I mean, they thought at that age, they were like, I'm set for life. I'm just going to be a shock guy. Who needs more than 1,000 a year? That's plenty.
What's the old line? That's an awful lot of gumballs and pizza.
Mm-hmm.
So start from the beginning. So I know you were in karts when you were younger, and I know you built and raced a Spitfire in the SCCA. You went to the runoffs, qualified the runoffs. Did you go?
Yep.
Qualify.
I never went because college had already started by the time the runoffs were around, and I was going to school.
So that was in your teens, but you got started in karts. Like how? Which again, a kart doesn't have dampers, but that does not mean it does not damp itself. It does not dampen the motion of its wheels, right? So how did you learn about this stuff?
Man, I think we're going to have to fast forward before I even really understood. So in karting, I never even thought about a damper. I didn't even know what it was. As I got into cars, there were shocks. I'm going to use shocks and dampers interchangeably here. So there were shocks on the car. And I had built the car, and I was trying to understand how it all worked, but I didn't really get dampers and what they were about, really. It just was kind of there. It was something to wrap the spring around, kind of like thing, And so as I got more and more into car racing, I did a bunch of short track stock car stuff with a guy by the name of Alan Kowicki, who went on to be a NASCAR Cup champion. Him and I grew up together. And we started to try to understand shock absorbers for our super late models, Alan and I. And Alan had a degree in engineering. I was finishing up mine. So we were really like, how does all this stuff work? And this was early 80s.
Okay.
Yeah, early 80s.
All right.
And so we were trying to understand. We had these shock absorbers, and they didn't have adjusters on them. And you could buy different stiffnesses. You could buy a stiff, a medium, and a soft, and then there were different manufacturers for these dampers. And so we wanted to, we were in a very competitive stock car series called ASA, which is kind of like it was the notch below what's now Xfinity. So it was like we were racing against Rusty Wallace and Mark Martin, and I mean it was pretty big. So we wanted to do well, and so we needed to understand this stuff. And being both engineers, we're trying to understand it. And so we would take a shock, the stiff one, and we would turn it upside down on the shop floor. And we would grab the body of it, and we would just push down as hard as we could on the floor. And we would feel how hard that was. And I would hand it to Alan, and Alan would push down, and he would go, "Okay, hand me the soft one." And we'd push down on the soft one, and I'd hand it to Alan, and he'd push down, and he'd go, "Okay, that seems like a lot softer. What do you think, 40%? I think 50. 40. Okay, we'll call it 45%." And we'd write that on there. And that's how we dynoed our shocks, because there were no dynos back in those days, or nothing that was available to anybody other than an OEM. So then we wanted to get better. So we built, I actually still have this. I just saw it today in my shop. We built a lever machine that you put the shock in. Picture a long handle. One end went to the vise. The other end went to the top of the shock. And then you'd pull down with this lever and compress the shock rather than just pushing it down on the shop floor. And we could pull it down and then push it up to check the rebound, which is the force the shock has when it extends. So Alan and I would bolt a shock in this thing, and we'd pull down on the lever and then push it up, and we would do our rating again. And then he'd bump me out of the way and go, "Let me try it." And he'd push it up, and we would rate our shocks. We had no scales. We didn't know what we were doing, but we could feel the difference. And that's how we tuned that's when shocks became, to me, something like, and we'd go to the racetrack, and we would, Alan would want the nose to hold down longer as he entered the corner, for instance. And we would go, "Well, get those shocks that were really hard to push up. They have a lot of rebound in them." So we'd go through our things from our machine testing. We'd put those ones on, and the nose would hold down more, and we'd go faster. I'm like, wow, there's a lot here. You can really tune a car with a shock. And so that's the very, very start of how I got started in understanding they were important.
Okay, so that's amazing, right? So what was the next step because the way every engineer's mind works, it doesn't matter what kind of person you are, but the cool thing about engineering is that it pushes you, if you're at all trained in it, it pushes you to quantify things, to get data, and to draw conclusions, to science the shit out of it. So how did you make the leap from, well, I can pull my arm down on this lever, to, I bet if I get some way to measure the load on the lever, then we have numbers on it. What was the next big jump in engineer Jeff looking at it and deciding, well, that learning wasn't good enough. How do we get more, bigger, better?
That's a great question. It's exactly what happened. It's like, okay, well, instead of just that's hard to push and that's easy to push, let's measure that. How are we going to do that? And then we realized that when we tried to push it faster, it was harder. So now you have to not only measure the force, you have to measure the speed that the shock is working at. And Alan and I were on to other things, and we weren't going to build a machine that did that. And I don't know exactly how I found out about it, but there was this guy by the name of Kurt Rohrig. And anybody that knows anything about shocks has heard of Kurt. Unfortunately, he passed away about 3 weeks ago, but he must have, and I never talked to Kurt about it either. I don't know how, but he must have thought the same thing. Totally, he wasn't a short track guy. I don't know how but he was like, I'm going to build a machine that tests shock absorbers that a normal race team can afford, not Monroe Shocks, does that for their, builds 100,000 of them for street cars, but somebody that a race team could buy. And he did all the science and built a machine that had basically an electric motor in it, and it would squish the shock together and pull it apart, and squish it together and pull it apart. It was on a crank, And it would do this. And while it did that, it measured the speed that the shock was moving in inches per second, that the shaft was moving. And it would measure the force that it took to do that. And it would draw you this really nice, pretty graph. And you could hit print and it would print it out on a sheet of paper. And now you could really understand it. And I don't know. I don't remember all the details of how I got in touch with Kurt, but I got in touch with Kurt and he was explaining it to me, and he had one and he showed me some stuff. And I was like, wow, I want one of those. And he said, I want to sell them. That's what I'm going to try to do. And I said, how much? And he said a number. And I went, whoa, that's a lot.
What quantifiably was it like? I mean, the number.
So this is the early 80s.
Like the cost of a set of tires, the cost of a car. What are we talking about?
No, it was $30,000 in 84, something like that. Yeah. Wow. Maybe I got the timing wrong. Whenever Kurt came out with this shock dyno, they were $30,000, and the thing was monstrous. It had a big, giant 5 horsepower motor in it. It sat, it's about the size of a refrigerator. That's the size of it, and it worked off at 220. It was huge.
I just had to look up for context because the only frame of reference I have for the mid 80s in money, my parents bought an 85 Volvo wagon new, and I just looked it up, and it turns out that car cost $16,000. For the price of 2 Volvo wagons, you could have had a shock dyno,
right?
Which is amazing,
right? So anyway, and I could have that wrong. Maybe it was 1990, but still, anyway,
yeah.
For me, it was like impossible, but I knew that if I could understand shocks better than anybody else, my cars would go faster because I was race engineering and I was just getting my feet wet in race engineering. I was getting paid a little bit to do it. It was my job for sure, but I could support a family. Probably maybe, but not really. But I wanted to get to that point. And now we must be talking more toward the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And I knew that here was something, I knew from my experience with Alan that this would make cars go faster if I could really understand it. And Kurt Rohrig had the machine that could help me really understand it. I just needed to put those two together. And I talked to my dad, and my dad said, he understood it all. He's like, yeah, you need to get one of those. I said, I can't get one of those. I'll loan you the money. I'm like, awesome. So my dad loaned me the money for a shock dyno. I bought it from Kurt. It was one of the first 5 that he had ever built. Real early. It shipped. I set it up, talked to Kurt, got it going. But I needed shocks. I was working for a race team, a Trans Am team. And so I did some of their shocks, but I needed more. So I started telling people, hey, I'll dyno your shocks. And back in those days, race teams, and pretty good race teams, not the factory teams, but pretty good Trans Am teams and semi-pro teams and even pro teams were like, dyno my shocks? Do I need that? What does that do for me? People just didn't really know. And I was like, no, it gives you a graph and it shows you how much force. And then when you click one of those clickers, you can see how much less force or more force it has. And then you can go to the racetrack and tune your car to go faster with your shock adjustments. It's like, wow. Okay. And so I said, I would make a deal. You send me your shocks and I'll dyno them for free. No cost. And people are like, all right. And I said, the only hook is on Monday morning after the race weekend, you got to call me and tell me how it worked. How did it handle different, the changes that I made? Because some of the shocks I could take apart and change things inside and make it better. We'd talk before and they would say, oh, my car always understeers. So.
Okay. So when you say make it better, was that always solution chasing? Like my car understeers, and you're like, well, this, that, or the other. Or you pulled a shock apart and went, this shim stack is yada yada blah when it really needs to be yada yada blee. Jeff, go and change it. Like, how did that work? How did you know what to change? I didn't know enough
at the time to be able to just pull a shock apart and go, oh, this is on a Formula Ford, and pull it apart and go, yeah, that'll never work. I didn't know. I didn't know.
So how'd you do it at that point?
Through this process. So I would take the shock apart and see what was in there. And most of this stuff was Penske shocks. They were the first real rebuildable, changeable, internally changeable shocks where a real person without special equipment could work on them.
And for people who don't know, that Penske is the same as Roger. That's the Penske, right? It's just one of his many business enterprises. And at some point we should do a show on how that all happened, because the story is pretty cool. But that was if I remember right, that was a landmark moment when they started selling those things to customers, right? I mean, that it made available to people, right?
For sure. The guy who ran that, I mean, it was Penske shocks, and Roger started it and funded it and did all of that. So full credit to Roger for doing that. But the guy was Jeff Ryan. Jeff Ryan still is doing it today. He has a company called JRI Shocks, and he builds incredible stuff. A lot of NASCAR stuff, but amazing shocks for like military Humvees that were in Iraq, and tanks and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, so he does all of this stuff. Just a great guy. Anyway, he ran Penske shocks, and they came up with the design of this serviceable shock. And you could take it apart real easy. There was oil in there. You'd pull it out. There'd be a piston with some little thin discs of stainless steel on there of various thickness, and you could stack those different ways, and it would change the flow of the oil through the piston, and that changed the force. You could make it harder to push it through, and the shock was stiffer. You could make it easier to push it through, and the shock was softer. And so with that advent, and then the shock dyno, you could go nuts. I mean, I spent hours and hours on my shock dyno trying different shock oils, because maybe thicker ones do something different than thinner ones, and different, or maybe automatic transmission fluid would work. Let's try that. I'd pour that in and we'd try it and try all of these oils to see what the difference was. You'd try different shims. You'd try building your own pistons by drilling holes in them and things like that. And it was all about what the force velocity curve was. And that's what the dyno gives you. It gives you a curve, a graph of the force of the shock versus the speed of the shock. And so early on, I would get a shock from a set of shocks. I would take them apart, see what was in there, write it all down, put it back together, and dyno it for the guy. Then I'd send it to him. And he would say, yeah, it always understeers. My car always understeers. And I would be like, okay. So I would take the front shocks and I would try some things that I thought would work and get new graphs, and I would send it back to him. And he'd call me up on Monday and he'd go, wow, less understeer. And I was like, all right. So I'm learning. I'm doing this for free, but I'm learning all of this stuff about how shocks work. And the good thing about it is, I had enough success where somebody would get one of those shocks from my shocks and would put it on their Formula Ford, and they'd finish 10 spots better than they normally do.
God.
And suddenly I'd get
everybody was right.
6 sets of Formula Ford shocks the next week. Yeah. We want the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it progressed more and more, and I was just doing tons and tons of shocks. And in comes Colin and Travis to do the work for me so I could look at the graphs and stuff. And we were just pumping out these shocks for zero. But I was getting smarter, and my car that I was running, I was making better and better and better. And then it was too much. And so I finally was like, okay, I need to charge something. So I started charging. I charged $300 a set.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, that'll calm it down. And it didn't. And then it was $500 a set, and that didn't calm it down. I said, okay, we got to stop this. I just don't have enough time in the day. We're going to charge $1,000 a set. And it was like, yeah, that didn't really slow it down either. And it was,
you tripled the price. Insert joke here about how racers will spend money, something, no matter what. That's amazing. God.
Well, it was good for me because of making some money and still learning all this stuff. And other people were going faster.
Yeah.
And when they got beat by somebody and I had a cool label when I would do the shocks, I would put Transact Race Engineering on the label and send them out, and people would look by and, and suddenly there was some series where you had to have Transact Race Engineering tuned shocks. And so it was great. Long story longer. Eventually, I had to start doing just shocks for the teams that I was race engineering for. But because I learned so much about shocks and how they worked and did so much research, I was able to do that and stop doing the shocks just for customers as a shock business.
Yeah. So what you mentioned earlier, the feedback loop on it, right? So the notion that, not a feedback loop, like the sense of a feedback loop, but the fact that you got feedback and incorporated that, and that was part of the whole process. How did that translate into, because eventually those, like the learnings from the lab and sitting there at the dyno must have ended up on the wall with you and in the paddock, right? What was that moment like? How did you pick it up from one place, or was there a kind of an awakening with it? How'd it go?
Yeah, I would say I got to work with drivers because I was taking my shocks that I had done, going to the track and trying to make that car go faster. Yeah. At the time, I was running, I think in the middle of that was the Ferrari 333, and I had Fermin Velez driving for me. Fermin's a little Spanish guy, super good, world champion, and probably the least technically knowledgeable driver I've ever worked with.
Oh, why is that? Like what is a
fast.
Wheel? What is a wheel? Least technically knowledgeable?
No, but like a damper, had no idea. He kind of knew what it was supposed to do, but he could describe a car though, and what it felt like. Amazing, just amazing. So I started with this whole shock thing with Fermin. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I bring out a graph and his eyes would glaze over in 1 second. He's like, and I would say, okay, forget it. I said, I made a change to the shock. You go out and tell me how it feels. And he goes, what shock? And I said, both fronts. And he would go, okay. And I said, I just want to know how it feels different. And so he would go out, drive, come in, and he would start to describe this thing in like immense detail. It's like, well, when I turn the steering wheel, I can't do a Spanish accent, but when I turn the steering wheel, the front, it starts to move, and then it seems like it holds, but then it goes down more at the end, and I don't like that. And I would make a change, and he would go back out, and he'd go, okay, now it moves, but it moves the same way all the way to it, and it stops. I'm like, and you like that? I like that. Okay. And I would say, so how, and his feedback was unbelievably accurate. And so I started to understand what a shock curve, the one I got off the dyno, and how that related to what the drivers felt. And so I could see one shock curve, and Fermin said, well, when the shock curve looked like this, it felt like this. And when it looked like this, it felt like this. So as we got going throughout the year and the next year, when he wanted a car to feel some different way, I could go, I know what the shock curve needs to look like to make it feel like that. And so I could start to build a shock to give him the feel he wanted. And go ahead.
No, I was just saying, what did you do? Because there has to have been, right? Because we live in an infinite universe. What did you do the moment when you wanted the car to feel a certain way? You're like, aha, I have a shock for that, or I have a curve for that. And you set the car up that way, and then he comes back and he's like, no, it's not good. Like, what happened when those two things didn't line up? They had to, right?
It did. And we both were, he would look at me and be disappointed, like he gave me the wrong answer. And I was like, no, that's the right answer. And I'd be like, so how do you get that feel? And he goes, he's like, well, when I'm driving, when I'm turning, and I look through the fender, through the wheel, through the tire, and I can see the shock absorber in my mind as I'm turning into this 140 mile an hour corner.
It's amazing.
As I'm turning in, I can see it. And then I feel it. I feel it with my whole body, what the shock is doing.
I now want to go out in the desert and do a lot of ayahuasca with Fermin Velez. He sounds amazing.
Yeah. He could do that so good. And so, yeah, when it didn't line up, it was great because then it was a learning thing. When it did line up, when I went, oh, he needs it to do this. And I said, here's the shock curve that'll do that. And I went back to the trailer and I ripped them apart and I put them back together and got all oily and we stuck them back on and we sent them out and it worked better. It's like, all right, didn't learn anything. But when it didn't, then I was like, well, okay, why? And we investigated and we got smarter and smarter and smarter. I did the same thing with Ross years later.
Ross?
Our Ross.
Okay.
Similar thing, but I was smarter. And so what I tried to do with Ross, we only had like 2 days. We were testing Riley and Scott.
Because you guys
were a prototype.
You were very briefly. You only worked on the same team once or twice, right? Once.
Yeah. This was just a test too.
Okay.
I don't even remember whose car it was, but anyway, it was a WSC car, so it was an open cockpit. Riley and Scott Mark III, I think.
Okay.
I mean, a real like a 600 horsepower. It was a fast car.
Yeah.
And it had Penske shocks on it, and Ross got me to come out, and I started out. I had known Ross for a long time, so I just pulled out the shock curves and I said, okay, here's what's on the car. Ross, look at this curve. Okay, go drive. And he'd drive. And I'd say, okay, click, click, click. And I'd say, here's what the new curve looks like. And Ross would go out and drive. And Ross started to learn what the curves were and what the curves felt like. And we did that for like maybe a half a day. And then we put it back to normal. And Ross went out and he came in and he goes, oh, I need a curve here. Give me a pencil. And he would grab my sheet and he would draw me the shock curve that he thought he wanted.
God, I'm so envious. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
What a great idea.
Yep. And then I would go back to the trailer, whistle the shock apart, because I knew how to get that shock curve, what shims and pistons and stuff, because I had done tens of thousands of them. And I would build one that got that curve, put it on. Ross would go out and go, yep, that's the handles just like I wanted.
Yeah. What was it like having him learn or watching him learn that stuff kind of in a condensed? Because it sounds like it sounds like, that scene in The Matrix where they inject him with the very first one, they inject him with a little knowledge and he's like, I know Kung Fu. Like it sounds like the Matrix injection for damper curving. Like what was it like watching him learn that in real time, kind of sped up? Because that kind of knowledge takes most people, even at a high pro level, it takes most people a long time to pick up because you just don't get the chance to do that.
It was cool with Ross, but I think I thought that every driver should be able to do that same thing. And I was clearly wrong. Ross picked it up just like that. Ross thought about it. He wanted to learn it. Other drivers were like, they couldn't really relate it too well. Some guys, since that time with Ross, have gotten it, and they've gotten it fantastic. But that was a unique thing. Ross was, he's the way he processes it and the way he tries to think about it was different than a lot of other people. I had, we should talk about my thing with Price Cobb. Price, a lot of people probably know Price Cobb. Won Le Mans, I don't know, at least once.
Yeah.
Right. Good guy. Price I was doing a thing for Paul Gentilozzi, Trans Am team, doing shocks. They hired me, come in and fix our shocks. Like, all right. So send me your shocks. So they sent me the shocks. I built some stuff up. I went to the racetrack. We went to Road Atlanta. Price Cobb was their like lead driver. Got to know Price. And we were trying, again, Price was one of these smart guys like Ross, in that he wanted to understand how the shocks work and what the curves did and how it felt and everything. And I remember him, this was one of those you talked about aha moments where I'm like, whoa. And this has stuck with me forever and ever. But he says, no, it's not handling right in turn one. It's not right in turn one. And I'm like, okay, well, what's it doing? And he's describing what it's doing. And he goes, that's not what I want. That's not what I want. And I would try to change and he would go out and he goes, that's not what I want. I said, well, how do I know what you want? And he goes, well, just look at the data. I said, what? Look at the data. And he goes, yeah, I'm telling you what I want in the data. He goes, look at the steering trace. You go down the straightaway. I turn the steering wheel into turn 1. You see my initial turn. And then you see me make this and this and this correction. That's what I don't want. What I want is to make that initial turn, because I do that with my hands. I go, that's what I want. And then I wait for a millisecond and I see if I get that. And if I don't, oh shit, I got to change my steering.
Sounds so simple, but
yeah. And I'm like, oh, he is telling me what he wants. All I got to do is look at the steering trace. And he goes, yeah, you get me to do that one turn and you're giving me what I want. But all that other stuff in the middle is what I don't want. And so from that point on, I took that on. And that's a great, okay, it's a little oversimplified, but there's a lot to be learned from what the driver wants, because sometimes they can't describe it. Price could describe it and do it, but it was a great learning experience for me on shocks.
I just had to Google to remind myself what price cap looks like, because it's, you know how it is. Like, you read about somebody over and over again, and you end up with sometimes their resume in your head, but you don't remember their face. And the only thing I could pull off the top of my head was that he had won Le Mans. I couldn't remember with who. It was in one of the silk cut
Jaguar,
Jags.
I think.
Yeah,
right?
in an XJR12.
Yeah.
B, I had forgotten that at one point he had this magnificent, and this is not sarcasm, he had a magnificent mullet, like just wonderful blonde mullet down to the back of his neck. Like, Price, if you ever hear this, salute, buddy. That is rad.
He is now into motorcycles. He's trying to break the land speed record in some motorcycle class.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Good.
Anyway,
so
cool guy, taught me a lot.
Where did it go from there? Because at this point in your career, like, you're not just at this point in your career, but this point in the evolution of the sport, right? We're getting to the point where dampers are being asked to do a lot more, and a lot of it hangs on aero control and, pitch and body control for the purposes of keeping the aero platform, a car's aero platform, stable. So how did that stuff come in? And when did I know that happened along, you've talked about how that happened along the kind of in the Ferrari era as well, but what is that like?
You're absolutely right. Because a shock controls them. I always think of it, and again, this is oversimplification for all you engineer friends out there. Just bear with me.
Please write letters. Tell me it's my fault. That's all.
Well, right.
That's what. Here.
But it controls the speed of the movement of the car.
Yeah.
Not the total amount of movement. It does a little bit, but that's kind of the spring's job. And the shock's job is to control how fast it gets there. So aerodynamically, when big aero started coming in, you needed to control, as you said, Sam, the platform of the car, the splitter, the underwing. You need to control all of that. And the dampers, shocks, could help in that control. They could make it not roll as much, or roll quicker, or take a set quicker, or whatever. The 333 Ferrari, we talked about in that episode. Everybody should go back and listen.
Right now, go.
Right. Well, wait till this one's over, then go.
Wait, right now. Just wait right now.
But go listen to that one. We had a thing I had developed with Jeff Ryan at Penske Racing called the hydraulic third spring. And you can go back and listen to that episode to understand what exactly that does and how it worked and the cool story about that. But that thing controlled the ride height of the car and let us run the car much lower. And for people watching on YouTube, I actually have one right here.
He very conveniently, before we started taping, he's holding it up now. It is this long cylindrical kind of like space dildo looking thing. But he very conveniently pulled the thing up on camera right before we started taping. He's like, man, I didn't know I had this. I thought, people have been asking for years if I have one. I was like, oh, cool, you have it now. You should make it into a lamp or something, or like a table centerpiece.
That thing right there was the key to unleashing the Ferrari 333's potential, because we could run it so much lower with that third spring, and that was hooked into the shock absorbers. So you had to make the shock absorbers work with this hydraulic third spring, and you could run the car like 10 millimeters lower, which I know doesn't sound like a lot, but in the world of underwings and aerodynamics, that was a lot.
But that hints at the cool part about all of this, right? And I've met people who don't believe this to be true, and then the good ones eventually see things and learn things that kind of flips that script on them. But ultimately, one of the great things about motorsport is, in as much as it is the person at the wheel and the engineers involved and the people working on the car making smart choices and tolerance stack up from those smart choices over time and learning and knowing when to do the right thing, whatever that is. It's also a game of millimeters and smaller than millimeters. In some cases, it's a gain of fractions of millimeters. And the notion that, like, you can look at a shock and think, well, okay, this curve is, a shock curve, Jeff, I mean, if I remember right, it's basically just a inverted kind of splayed V, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Mm-hmm.
the mirror version of that on the other side of the graph is the same thing, but it looks like there's a ramp up and then there's a peak and then there's a fall off or a level.
Right.
And, you can look at those curves and think, well, that curve A and curve B are very similar, and the car can feel massively different because of it. And a lot of people don't think that these changes and that shocks in general, tiny, tiny changes, make a difference. But even on the dumbest club car, the most Stone Age club car, they do. It's cool.
You hit on a great point, is the feel of the car.
Yeah.
The shocks have a massive influence into what the driver feels, because they're feeling that change. They're feeling the change in pitch. They're feeling the front go down. They're feeling the car roll. They're feeling its dynamics. And the shock absorbers have a massive influence on that. So when I've always said that if I can give if I have a good pro driver and I can give him a car that feels the way he wants it to feel, and Price helped me learn how to understand that. Good drivers, Fermin Velez, could give me how he wanted it to feel. So as long as I can get that, how he wants it to feel, and then I can give it to him with shock changes, he'll get the best out of the car. He will drive it to his maximum. That might be different than another driver in what feel they want. But my goal has been always to give the driver, to make the car feel exactly like the driver wants it to feel. Then I know he can extract his maximum. Whatever level that is, he'll get his maximum out of it. And the shocks have been probably the single biggest tool that's allowed me to change the feel of the car to suit what each individual driver wants.
So I know that, I mean, the funny thing about race cars in general, machines, is that they're systems, right? And I know that the dumber the system, the broader, the larger the change you need to make in the system in order to see a change in the system, right? Which is why, like, when I said dumb club cars, I didn't mean like your Miata is dumb. I mean that compared to a P2 car, it is a pretty dumb system. There's not a lot of complexity in it. There's a lot of things going on, but not a lot of factors that you can screw with. And, an LMP2 car is on the other end of that spectrum. But so if you have something like a Miata, where big changes in valving, big changes in those clickers or even small changes in those clickers make a big difference. What are we talking about, for the last 20, 30 years, if you're making a change between drivers? Driver A wants a car that feels like this. Driver B wants a car that feels like that. They're both clicking out, within a couple of hundredths of each other. They're as similar as they can get. They just have different styles. Has that variable, has that window within which you'll change the car, has that shrunk over time as the cars have kind of evolved and gotten more complicated and higher resolution? Or is it, and what are we talking about? Is it like a click?
I think it's probably shrunk. And I think it's probably shrunk. Well, maybe that's not true. As I've been fortunate enough to move up in the racing hierarchy and get better and better and better drivers, to where I've gotten in the last, 10 years, I've got to work with world-class drivers. Those guys will adjust their driving to whatever the tire needs, what the car needs, what the aerodynamics needs. So they're better at adjusting what they need to do to extract the most out of it. And so their feel of it's closer. I can have 3 drivers in a top LMP2 prototype, or I'm sure a GTP car is the same way. And those guys, they're not going to be far off in how they want it to feel, because how they want it to feel is the feel that makes it go the fastest around, and they can adjust to it.
Makes sense.
as you get down the level, they may be like, man, this car understeers like crazy. I can't stand it. Another guy jumps in. He goes, man, this car is loose as heck getting into the corner. I can't stand it, because they just don't know as much. But even with that, if you get a beginner and it's just like, oh man, it's loose like crazy. I can't turn in. It's scary. Da, 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 da. You can still use the shock absorber to change that feel so it's not that way. And his buddy can jump in and it's the same car and it's understeer like crazy. Well, you can use the shock absorber to adjust for him. Obviously not in a pit stop or anything, but it's a way of pointing out how powerful they are. At that pro level, yes, it's a click or two. That's a 20-pound change in the force at 1 inch per second of speed that the shock is moving. It's a small change, but it can change the feel of the car for a driver.
Man, there's so much left to unpack that we just don't have time for. We'll probably do this again, but mainly for that reason. But there are 3 things before we started taping, you sent me some notes, just things that were kind of on your mind with this. And there are 3 things here that we didn't get to that I really want to hit on. And I'm just going to rattle them off. And I want you to give me the short version if you can.
Okay, I can hit it fast.
Only so we don't go over time. But okay, one of them was trying to understand hysteresis. Is it good or bad? How did that happen? Define hysteresis in a sentence or so, which I'm pretty sure I know what it is, but maybe not.
Yeah. So in a shock absorber, hysteresis, I'm sure there's a really good technical explanation for it. But hysteresis is if you're pulling the shock apart, it has some force. And it's the change in force when you change direction.
Okay.
So it should work. It should have the same force. If everything's equal, you have the force. I'm not describing it very good. It's the change in force when you change the direction. Some people like big hysteresis where, it's not, what do we do? Ketchup with the aerodynamics?
Oh, God, I forgot about our wind tunnel analogy involved ketchup on a piece of wood. And it was so great that I made a t-shirt design that we haven't released yet. But go on.
Okay. Here's the way to think of it. If you have one of those foam pillows at home, one of those foam ones, and then you have one of those feather ones, if the foam one has low hysteresis, you push in on it and you let go and it comes right back. That's low hysteresis. The feather pillow has high hysteresis. You push in on it and it just kind of sticks there and comes back really slowly.
Okay. So it's, it was, speaking of Haney, what was it? The book he wrote that was published by the SAE. Your friend Paul Haney, the gentleman from the Inside Racing book, wrote a book on tire technology years ago. And it applies on a molecular level with tires too, right?
Yep.
It's the resistance of the system to changes of any type. So how...
And there's...
Oh, sorry.
Shock absorbers have hysteresis.
Yeah.
They work if you push them in and slow. If it's the way to think of it is if you're pushing the shock in fast and then you slow it down, it's what the difference is in the force between those 2 parts of the curve.
Okay.
Some shocks have a lot of hysteresis. Some don't. And it was, I could never figure out, was it good? Was it bad? Somebody goes, oh, you don't want hysteresis. So I tried to build shocks without them. And you can measure it on the dyno. And I don't know if it really went any faster. And other guys are like, oh, you want shocks with lots of hysteresis. I'm like, really? I thought it was no hysteresis. And I tried to figure it out. Turns out I was not smart enough. A lot smarter people than me. It didn't seem to have a huge difference. But low hysteresis is kind of the way people want to go. And some shocks now are built with that goal in mind. The dynamic spool valve shock is a lower hysteresis shock because of that.
So does this have anything to do with, and this question will probably reveal my ignorance. Ha ha ha, now we do it. No, Sam, it didn't happen 30 episodes ago. Yes, of course. But no, does this have anything to do with how, a lot of the commercially available Penske's that you see on club cars famously have the seals are really loose fitting. They weep. the seals on the piston seals on the shaft. Does this have anything to do with that? They're set up
Yep.
that way so that they don't put any additional friction into the system. That's
Yep.
got to be related, right?
Exactly. I used to peel the top seal, the lip seal, out of my Penske shocks and just throw them away.
The first set
lower that hysteresis.
First set I remember, I was on a car I was sharing with a friend, and we got out of it, and I saw it because they weep, and the shafts are covered in a little film of oil when you're done. And I looked at the guy who built the car. I'm like, "Is that normal? It's shocks weep." He's like, "No, they're fresh." And I went, "Okay, cool. I now have things to Google. Go away and ask stupid questions later."
Yeah. It was an attempt to try to reduce that hysteresis, and it's not a terrible thing. I mean, people shouldn't go out, "Oh, my shocks are terrible. I have too much hysteresis." It's just a thing that, again, those are the little minute things I was trying to understand. And guys like Jeff Ryan and Kurt Rohrig and John Francois Chrétien.
It's an amazing name.
He's the master of dynamic multimatic company dynamic shocks. JF. He goes by JF. Everybody in the racing world knows him as JF. The guy is brilliant. He's taught me a lot about that stuff.
Okay, so second thing on that list of stuff you sent me that we didn't get to, what I have here is the not illegal, in your words, the not illegal NASCAR shocks that for sure were not within the spirit and intent of the rules, but got pole at the Busch race at Daytona with Mike Wallace before they were banned. How crudely I built them. What the hell is that? It sounds amazing.
So Mike Wallace, Rusty's brother, calls me up, and he's going to go, because I had worked with Rusty before on some shock stuff, that when he was doing NASCAR, and I was doing sports cars at the time. And Mike calls me up and says, "Hey, I'm going to Daytona. I'm going to try to, run this Busch car." I'm like, "Okay." He goes, "I need some shocks." And I said, "Okay, send me what you got." And he sent them to me. I looked at them, and then he goes, "Here's the deal. NASCAR has a new rule that your quarter panels, the rear quarter panel height, like the deck lid basically, has to be a certain height. Like they measure it at the end of a qualifying run, because people were running like really soft springs at the rear, and the whole car would just sag way down and pull the spoiler out of the air. Because at Daytona, it was all about top speed, and you got to get that big blade, that big spoiler they had, out of the air. So people were running their cars way nose up with the rear wheel way down, and NASCAR went, whoa. At the end of qualifying, we're going to measure your car. You're going to come down pit lane, roll down to a box, and we're going to take these little sticks on a stand, and your car better touch. It better be that high. The back of the car better be up in the air that high." And I'm like, "Okay. Yeah, all right. So what do we gain if we lower it?" He goes, "A lot." Mike Wallace said, a lot. So I'm playing on my shock dyno, and I'm thinking what I need to do is figure out a shock that would compress and then stick there, kind of like a, I don't know, I couldn't figure out how to do it, a ratchet or something where it would compress real easy and then get really hard so it wouldn't come back. And I couldn't figure it out. I was like trying to invent this stuff on my lathe and all that stuff. And finally I just if people know what a shock is, it's basically, or how one of these Penske's looks, it's a tube with a piston that goes up and down in it. And it's the piston is sealed against the tube so that all the oil has to flow through the piston. What I did is I took a die grinder in the tube, and I ground a groove down the tube to about 2 inches from the bottom. So you'd put the car on the track, the spring would compress for the aerodynamic forces, and the shock would go down real easy because all the fluid just passed around the shock around the piston through that groove. And then it would push it down so far that it would get stuck down past that groove, and it would hold it down there because I had massive shims on the rebound side. So it would hold it down there. And he would go out and do a lap, and he would come in the pits, and the back of the car would be down as you could see it coming rolling down pit lane. It would be down,
and then
down. He would slow down, and all of a sudden there was enough time had passed, 20 seconds, and the thing would go boing.
That's so cool.
And the back of the car would pop up. And that was about the time NASCAR checked the height. And we got pole with that thing. It was so fast.
How did they find out about it? How did they catch you?
I don't know. No, we got the pole and he raced it. I don't remember how he did. I don't know. We probably crashed or something. Not that Mike crashes, but you're at Daytona in a bush race. It's likely a crash that takes you out.
Right.
But it worked great. I don't know where those shocks are now. They're someplace. Shortly after that, and I won't take credit for we've talked about you love a rule that's made because of you. I won't take credit for this one because I was just one guy. There was lots of other smarter guys doing probably way cooler stuff. But they did start to do handout shocks. When you went to Daytona, NASCAR would hand you spec shocks built by Penske. You would roll through tech with no shocks on your car. They would hand you two, and you bolted them on your car and went and qualified. When you were done, you took them off and they handed them to the next guy. They had 10 sets or whatever. So NASCAR solved that by just going to handout shocks, spec shocks that were sealed that you couldn't touch.
Well, I think that's about all we have time for, which is a bummer because I could ask silly shock questions all day.
I got one. Can I
do it?
One more story?
Yeah, lay it on me, please.
This is a story that I just think is cool from a cool guy, Larry Holt. Some guys know Larry Holt. He's the head of Multimatic.
Yeah,
like he's a. I don't know. How would you describe him, Sam? Icon?
Mad scientist, wizard. He's kind of like the Burt Rutan. We were talking about this earlier. If you know airplanes at all, he's like the Burt Rutan of out there racing ideas. And right. Jeff put this really well earlier. He said, the thing about Larry is that you just imagine that all of his ideas, every time he says one of them, everybody else goes, well, no, that won't. Wait, that could work. And then it ends up working.
Right.
And Multimatic has done, they're famously now connected to spool valve shocks on production cars, including off-road trucks, things like that. But the Ford Raptor. But they did, what was it they did? Most recent project wasn't the Ford GT, but they built the road car Ford GT and did the comp cars. What else have they done recent era?
Well, they're doing the current Ford GT3.
That's right. Yeah.
And are they Valkyrie? Are they doing the Valkyrie GTP?
I think so, yeah.
I think so.
Really cool company. And Holt is one of the guys, arguably the guy, but that's a discussion another time. At the core,
he's the guy.
Yeah.
So they're designing the spool valve shock, as you talked about, and it uses a whole different technology rather than those flat stainless steel shims I was talking about. Has lower hysteresis, has lots of advantages of a spool valve shock. So anyway, they're designing the thing, and they have clickers. Everybody knows adjustments. You can click, make it stiffer, click, make it softer. So the engineers are talking to Larry, and Larry is a brilliant engineer. I mean, he's one of those genius guys, like Elon Musk, who can talk about it business-wise, but probably can also go out there and actually draw the drawing and then weld the thing and make it himself and understand all the physics behind it. That's Larry. So they showed him the design, and Larry goes, okay, yeah, it makes sense. We're making these clickers. We're going to have clicks, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 being the stiffest, kind of what you would do, right? And Larry goes, no, we're going to have, I want 11 positions. We're going to have 11 being the stiffest.
Wait, really?
Right. And some engineer went, why? And he goes, because you can.
Because it's one louder, isn't it? Yeah.
Right. Turns out Larry's favorite movie
is Spinal Tap.
Like favorite movie times 100. And so his shocks go to 11.
If you
check out, go to a dynamic spool valve shock, they go to 11.
If you haven't seen it, Spinal Tap is great. It's a mockumentary on rock and roll culture in the late 70s. And it's spectacular. And there's a scene with amplifier knobs that goes to 11.
It goes to 11. Right.
With that, we're out of time. That's our show. As always, thank you for listening. We appreciate you. We're glad you're here. Ross is glad you're here, even though he's currently having a great time, probably not getting eaten by bears at all in Yosemite. I say that just mainly because I don't want it to happen. That would be bad. But he will be back with us next episode, we think, probably. Tune in next week for, I don't even know what we have in the schedule for next week. Our schedule got so kind of thrown into a blender when Mike's producing laptop a week ago died and we lost our episode for that week. But all of that said, I should probably wrap this up and read us out. Jeff, should I read us out?
Go ahead. I tried that once. You do it.
You guys did such a great job with it. I should stop. I should just demand other people do it. So, It's Not the Car is produced by us. Mike Perlman is our executive producer, and he has very good hair, of which I am envious because, well, I'm cursed genetically in so many ways, but that's another story for another time.
Apparently, he has a very bad computer, though.
Oh, yeah. God giveth and God taketh away. I am the show's creator. I created this. Blame me for all of this. For more on bonus content, perks, and future live events, you can subscribe to our free news feed. It's at patreon.com/notthecar. That option is at the 3 little dots in the upper right side of the screen on our Patreon page. And just as a side note, we have a lot of cool bonus content there. I actually just released one for the Daytona episode last week as we're taping this, but we're slowly ramping up. Our Patreon benefit's going to get very cool very soon. It's already pretty cool. We like it. We appreciate the support. If you like this episode, I should get back to the script. If you like this episode, listen to me preempting myself, and you'd like to support what we do here, check out that same Patreon link and click, quote, become a member. If you do that, we will love you forever. That's not a lie. That's a promise. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with anyone you think might enjoy it, unless that person is... unless it's Bernie Eccleston, because Bernie still owes me like $5 for legal reasons. I can't say anything more. Bernie knows why. When you share the show, it makes a huge difference. It really does help us keep Not the Car on the air. And as always, thank you for listening.
Have fun.